Okay, we are ready. Good afternoon and good morning, Mark. Welcome everyone. I have the pleasure to introduce the fourth lecture concerning integral design and research, a lecture series by Mark DeKay. Just a few words about the context and the protagonist of this event. As many of you know, Mark DeKay is a full professor of architecture at the University of Tennessee, specializing in sustainable design theory, research, and design tools. His current work is concerning various applications of integral theory in the experience of sustainable design and to experience nature via buildings. From the beginning of March 2021, Mark is visiting professor at the Iuav University of Venice within the research infrastructure, IRIDE, that works for an integral design environment. In IRIDE, the Pride laboratory, which is organizing and editing this lecture series, is developing studies on the modification and innovation of design paradigms in an analytical dimension of complexity and within an integrated vision of project cultures. The lectures are introducing a framework for thinking about design and design research at any scale. It is an approach built on the integral theory and developed for architecture in the DeKay's book, in the Integral Sustainable Design, Transformative Perspectives. The collaborative teams represented in the Integral Design and Research lecture series use this approach because it is useful in tackling and making sense of the difficult and complex problems facing the design and planning disciplines today. In a few minutes, we will attend a lecture by Mark DeKay and Pygmalion Karatzas. Pygmalion is architect and photographer, studied architecture in Budapest and Edinburgh. Since 2013, he is focusing systematically on architectural and fine art photography, producing commercial and artistic projects from Europe, USA, and Middle East. His images are regularly featured in Greek and international media, have received 94 distinctions from leading global photographic competition, and the prestigious Fulbright Artist Scholarship, Fulbright Artist Scholarship Award from 2015. He participated in exhibitions in Greece, Italy, France, UK, and USA, and produced 10 book collections, receiving prizes with the Integral Lens and Nortigo Architecture Abstractions. Through photojournalistic reportage, collaborations with architectural firms, business and organization, as well as self-initiated projects, he exhibits his passion and dedication to the study, representation, and dissemination of the built environment and its broader role as a cultural asset. The lecture will analyze the employing of the integral model to understand architectural photography, making the photograph the photo itself, and viewing the photo. Development of architectural photography across the traditional, modern, postmodern, and integral worldview. Karatzas Fulbright Artist Integral Lens Project, at least. The title of this fourth lecture is The Integral Lens Perspective on Architectural Photography. Thank you, Mark and Pygmalion. The floor is yours.
Mark your microphone.
There we go. All right, very good. Can you see my screen there, everyone?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Well, good afternoon and welcome. It's great to be back for the fourth in this series. Thank you for having me again. You are in for a visual treat today. I'm really pleased to be sharing this presentation with architect and architectural photographer Pygmalion Karatzas from Patras, Greece. We have been collaborating for 7 years now in various ways and applying the integral model to architectural photography. That is Pygmalion's profession, and it is my sometimes hobby. So he's the real expert here in this regard, and I've really learned a lot by working with him. I really like the fruits of collaboration, especially when you're working with someone who's even more unreasonable and intense than I am. Our collaboration started in 2015 when I was the faculty sponsor for Pygmalion's Fulbright Artist project. He came to the US, and here at the University of Tennessee, we were the host school, and he'll tell you more about this later. After that, we began working on an article, and we published a paper quite long, surprisingly, for a conference. We presented this in Hungary at the Integral European Conference, and this was the first paper to apply integral thought, the integral model, to photography. In 2019, we co-developed and led, along with Suzanne Bennett, who you heard from last time, an academic course. It was more like a 3-week traveling workshop, and we called it Capturing the Human Experience in Place. We traveled around Greece with students from Tennessee, and you'll see a little bit more of that later in the program. This is what you see here is a piece of part of an exhibit that we produced. It was actually very long, not stacked like this. So that's a little bit about our background and our work together. We have 3 parts to the talk today. The first part, we'll try to make sense out of architectural photography, which is a little hard for me in the beginning to understand. So the integral model really helped me to unpack that and to make some sense out of what we were looking at with all the different variations that one can find. So we'll look at quadrants and levels and combinations of quadrants and levels. You've seen that in the first 3 lectures, and today we'll expand on the idea of types and how types can actually stay consistent through all the levels and how types and levels combine. So let's get started here with looking at the 4 fundamental perspectives. We'll use some historical examples to do that. This is an image by Walker Evans in what we might call the documentary style. It represents an objective view, very little intervention between subject and object, and it's descriptively trying to record the American vernacular. It's third person. It's a view of the built environment, which is intentionally taking the photographer's point of view out of the frame as much as possible. Contrast this to Edward Steichen's image of the Flatiron Building in New York City as part of the pictorialist movement. And they were presenting a perspective in which reality is less important than the impression that the image gives. It's a first-person perspective, highly subjective. The photographer is really intending to engender an aesthetic experience in the viewer. So we have these expressive possibilities and the artistic potential of the medium that come into focus. Then again, switching perspectives, Charles Sheeler has a narrative perspective, uses symbolic imagery here in the Ford Motor Plant in Michigan. What we see here is a more intersubjective view. We're enrolling the viewer in a cultural story where it's trying to say something about what the built environment means, and that takes priority. So photography, in this sense, it sits inside a second-person view. There's a we perspective, and it has the focus on this collective interpretation and the influence of the symbols. And then finally, fourth, Bill Hedrick, and a very famous image from Falling Water, the Edgar Kaufman house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. This was actually a commissioned photograph by Architectural Forum magazine. This is photography that's intended to make the really best presentation of an architect's work, something to be published and consumed by other architects and future clients. So it's situated, commercial architectural photography, situated in its context of production. So looking back at these four perspectives historically, within 20th century, all of these, we have these four different perspectives that parse out nicely into our integral framing. When we apply this to architectural photography, we can talk about the photographic eye in the upper left, giving us images whose primary focus is self-expression, vision, aesthetics, and so forth. The photographic frame gives us images whose primary focus is the image itself. It's about the subject matter, the composition, its observable features. We can look at it quite formally and analytically. In the lower left, we talk about the photographic view. There we have images whose focus is cultural interpretation, shared values, worldviews, and so on. And then finally, the photographic practice in the lower right. We have images whose primary focus has to do with the socio-economic context, the means of production, branding, and business, and so forth. Okay, so that's quadrants, and now let's move to levels or stages. This is an image from Bernice Abbott, one of the early realists. So these were photographers who, early 20th century, prioritizing rigorous observation. They had a mastery of the technique and of composition, and just went around systematically recording subjects with a high degree of intensity. So we can consider this at photography's sort of beginning level, you might say. Even though it's the modern period culturally, the technology is relatively new, and it's a quite traditional use of the medium. Another historical example of this traditional level, the French photographer Eugene Atget. He was a pioneer in documentary architectural photography. And imagine back then you had to take pictures of things that remained quite still. Right? And so he was determined to go around and document all of the scenes in Paris before they disappeared to modernization. Moving on to the modern era and the modern worldview, here is Ezra Stoller's image of Saarinen's TWA terminal. We see this modern view giving rise to a distinction between the image and what it represents. It's introducing this articulation also of the individual, personal expression of the photographer. So modern architectural photography strives to both represent the building objectively, but also now to give the viewers an experience of architecture as space. Another characteristic of this modern worldview on architectural photography is that it takes on this dominant and iconic image, such as you see here in Julius Schulman's view of Case Study House number 22 in Los Angeles. And this has really become an iconic and influential image in architecture. And then from the postmodern worldview, architectural photography sometimes incorporates these elements of very straight life as it is representation, and also the spatial complexity. So it's including both a traditional and a modern aspect, but the emphasis is not really on the buildings themselves, neither as documenting the buildings or as displaying their design. It's holding up a mirror, of the man-altered landscape, and presenting us with this cognitive dissonance about the global implications of the way that we've developed. On the more editorial side, we can see that another characteristic of postmodernism, I guess of not just editorial, but any postmodern worldview, is contextualism. That is, we try to understand something, anything at all, by placing it into its larger context. So in this view, the photographer is seeking to explain and to situate architecture as a response to its urban and social context. This is an image from Alan Karchmer. I actually worked for Alan for a while when he was starting off as a young photographer in New Orleans. This is his image of the Steger Center. And you can see this shift in commercial photography from architecture as space, back with Ezra Stoller, to now architecture in context. We see the building, but we also see the urban situation that it's placed inside of. And then finally, from the integral level, one can really always, one way we describe that is that you can see and become aware of the full developmental unfoldment in any quadrant. In this case, we're focusing on the lower left quadrant, the cultures. And you can find something valuable about each of those preceding views. So something valuable in documentation, something valuable as seeing architecture as space, something valuable about understanding the context. Here in Berdani's floating village, it's kind of resonating, I think, with this raw immediacy of the scene, while it's also elevating what's ordinary to a sublime kind of perspective. And it allows the viewer to become the witness of the natural and the built environment in their relationship. And that kind of backed off perspective of seeing the big picture is part of the integral worldview. Another example that we place in this category is Iwan Ban. This is his Makoto floating school. He went around and looked at 52 cities in 52 weeks. It's an engaged commentary, right? It's not just abstract or distant, it's engaged about telling you something about the relationship between people, society, and the environment. And this aerial point of view reveals the larger contextual systems. So at the integral level, we have this inclusion of multiple perspectives. Architecture as the setting for life, and also as something that's in dynamic interaction with natural processes and social processes. Another photographer that we feel includes and transcends these three previous photographic views, Edward Burtynsky, very stunning visual language, but a lot of his work is actively engaged with social and environmental issues and implications. And he seems to have an ability to communicate and connect with audiences from a range of different worldviews. And so this begins to set this work apart from other postmodern perspectives, even the topographists, we call them. So we use these four basic levels, these four distinct perspectives or quadrants, and we can generate 16 unique and all partially valid prospects on architectural photography. Metaphorically, we call these lenses. This is the same approach that you saw in the first lecture when we looked at sustainable design and had 16 prospects. And then in the research lecture with Astrid Rotzel, we looked at architectural inhabitation, and we could also unfold that. We call those the 16 spaces. So now this is too complex to go into in this presentation, but for now, we can just simply look at the progression in the upper left, on the left-hand column, the realm of the self, what we call the photographic eye. These are Pygmalion's framings, these four quadrants. And so we can see this progression from the photographer as pioneer in the traditional to, in the modern, a professional for hire, to, in the postmodern, becoming a cultural critic and taking a position on things, and then in the integral to a catalyst for becoming more aware and for the environment becoming more whole. All right, so that's quadrants, levels. We're mostly familiar with that, which is why I went through it rather quickly. Now we move on to types in architectural photography. And a type is something that, you can have a type in human beings, masculine and feminine. You can have all kinds of different types in different quadrants, personality types and so forth. In architectural photography, it has to do with the application of whether it's topographic or what we call documentary, editorial, commercial, or on the other hand, expressive or more fine art. So one way to look at that is to look at the same building through the eyes of three different photographers. On the left, we have Iuav taking a more documentation approach. All three of these are the Beijing National Stadium in China. So Bond's approach is more photojournalistic and more anthropological. You can see this is a nighttime scene with the construction workers watching television with the building sort of in the background. In the center, Tim Griffith takes more of an editorial approach. It synthesizes this view between, the photographer's view and the architect's, and trying to appeal to the firm's portfolio and look at this as something that is set in the context of the photographic industry. And then on the right, Irene Kung, more expressionistic, using a more painterly approach that makes the building into a fine art image that you might see in a public or a private gallery. Another way to illustrate types is to look at images that have similar subject and shooting method. So these are different buildings, but similar kinds of photographic techniques. All three were taken from carefully selected elevated vantage points. So instead of on the ground, the shot is actually somehow from another building or from another vantage point that allows the photographer to get high off the ground. And yet the experience of each of these three is different. So Michael Wolff on the left from Hong Kong is telling us about issues of scale and density that apply lots of places. Yarolimbos, a Greek photographer, this image here in the center of Jean Nouvel's tower, it's bringing that closer to the key elements of the design. It's presenting it as a piece of architecture designed by an architect. And then Shannon McGrath, the image of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao on the right, more of an expressive painting. So we can also intersect, and we use the framing of integral to intersect both levels and types. And then we were able to, by doing that, finally to begin to understand lots of the significant variations inside of this field of architectural photography with so many different kinds of imageries. So in this sense, we have the levels on the left and then the types going across in the columns. So we actually have in the paper groupings of photographers. So there's names associated with each of these kinds of clusters. And this is just, it's not the truth. It's what we say. It's an integrally informed map that helps us to understand the field. So as a couple of examples, at the integral level, when we're using the documentary type, we call that the reconstructionists, right? Post-deconstruction, now we're reconstructing. Yorgos Yarolimbos, for 6 years, documented the construction of the Niarchos Cultural Center in Athens, designed by Renzo Piano, and he called his series orthographs. And these were taken, if you can imagine, he's hanging on a crane 100 meters over the construction site every day, shooting straight down. So we see both a kind of objective documentation of the construction process. We're looking at the roofing being installed here. And there's an abstract order that emerges out of the complexity of the site. Fernando Guerra has been really a pioneer in the way architecture is photographed and divulged. Here we have the integral level combined with the editorial type. So he takes a lot of photos of Alvaro Siza's buildings. This is one of Siza's buildings, and you can see in China, you can see this modern form language. But it's also seen from a rare vantage on the water, right? And in the rain. And then included, almost like you're taking the perspective of the person in the boat. Here's this figure that might be local, perhaps of a different economic class. So multiple perspectives. That's how we think of the a-perspectivists, we call them, not privileging any particular perspective, but often employing multiple meanings at once. Now, postmodernism was really suspect of beauty. In fact, I didn't hear beauty in my architecture school ever. Never heard the term. And indeed, postmodernism is suspect of most individual perceptions. So at the integral level, beauty can then come back. It resurfaces in the form, in this case, of fine art photography of the built environment. This is an image by John Cosmopoulos. And he talks about this movement as an essential condition of the felt aesthetic. He says the feeling of being immersed in and inspired by something intellectually and imaginatively beautiful. In the second part, Pygmalion is going to introduce his integral lens project, along with our collaboration on teaching architectural photography to students of art and architecture and interior design. But first, we'll have a little video, the first of three. It's about 4 minutes, and this is an excerpt from a 5-part photographic exhibit in video format that we did last year for the Integral European Conference. You can see this all on YouTube in the longer version. What you'll see coming up here is a series of time-lapse sequences. Those are paired with long exposure still images of the same places. So watch for that. There's a time lapse and then a still image. And the still image, most of these are very long exposures, 1 or 2 minutes long sometimes. And the time lapses are not done with video, but they're composites that are done with the still camera. So let's see how this works. I love the way that this technique of the time lapse and hyperlapse speeds up time, and then contrasted with the long exposure, which for me seems to take a lot of time and compress it into one image. So thank you. Those were all, Pygmalion's images there.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Margherita, for the invitation and the introduction. Thank you, Mark, for the partnership. 7 years of really unique collaborations together. I am honored to present this material with you. The second part of the lecture will present my photographic project, Integral Lens, sponsored by Fulbright Foundation in Greece. I studied and practiced architecture for 12 years before switching to professional photography. I am a self-taught photographer. Some of the work I did starting out included personal projects, commission assignments, and various collaborations. The Morphogenesis collections were fine art interpretations of buildings from European countries like Greece, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, and Scotland. The Expo Milano pavilions was a commission by the Danish Architecture Center. The architecture guide Doha was done in collaboration with various media outlets and the Qatar Foundation. Through galleries and competitions, the work was published and exhibited. This body of work became my portfolio when I submitted for the scholarship. The funding was planned for 5 months in the United States. So I saw this as an opportunity to expand on the work I have been doing so far. I had studied Ken Wilber's integral theory for about 6 years and participated in the Eco-Village Design Education course in Finhorn in 2006. The Fulbright project asked for an academic affiliation, so I felt Mark's work was an ideal collaboration. The proposed project was titled An Integral Approach to the Study and Representation of the Built Environment Through the Photographic Medium. I used the 4 quadrants to organize it. This is a loose framing in the 4 quadrants at the time of the proposal. I arrived in Knoxville, where I spent the first 2 weeks, then flew to New York, where I stayed for 3 weeks, took a bus to Boston to spend the next 2 weeks, flew to Chicago and stayed for 10 days, then moved to east to Los Angeles for 3 weeks. By car, visited Las Vegas and the West Coast to San Francisco, where I stayed for 10 days. From there, I flew up north to Seattle for 1 week. The next stop was Denver for 10 days. The next flight to Miami for 1 week, and then to New Orleans for 1 more week. I completed this trip, returning to Knoxville for 2 weeks before departing for Greece. It was a long project with many locations to explore for the first time, to research the contemporary architecture in the city, to decide how many buildings I can visit each day, to organize the logistics and plan my daily schedule. It was not possible to plan everything beforehand, and I allowed for some adjustment. Some buildings were discovered along the way, and additional time was given to explore parts of the city. It was an intense and physically challenging program in order to experience and capture as much as possible in each location. Looking at the statistics from this trip, I am reminded of an observation the photographer Michael Kenna made in one interview. He noted that if he stopped photographing now, he would still have enough material to process for years to come. I feel this applies to my project as well. the two main parallel photographic disciplines I followed, one, the building as a client, and two, the building as an artistic subject. So we are combining the fast pace of the editorial architecture photography with the slow pace of exploring the urban landscape. I will briefly mention some aspects in the editorial approach. These are images from the New World Symphony Hall in Miami, designed by Frank Gehry. One aspect is including both interior and exterior images. This also relates to the aspect of accessibility and permissions, which require extra time, both before the photo shoot, but also during the visit. A primary aspect is to explore the building photographically. The client hires you to take your time with this exploration. Captures at different times of the day will show how light and shadows interact with form and materials. During dusk and the blue hour, the artificial light adds to the ambience. So many images are taken in order to arrive at a select hue. In this case, about 200 images were taken and about 26 finals were selected. Another aspect is post-processing. This is one example of before-after in Lightroom and Photoshop. I use natural high dynamic range to bring out both the highlights and the shadows. I also use different exposures in selected areas to lighten the scene. The white balance is carefully selected depending on the mood of the scene. Each image is processed individually. The underlying goal is to add a strong presence, depth, and complementary lighting. A few examples of projects. This is the community rowing boathouse in Boston. After publication, the architects selected the images for their portfolio and websites. With such panel presentation, we see context views, close-ups of the facade, and customized material applications. This is the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The images were selected by an architecture historian for a book publication about the museum. The editorial brief is a cognitive list of different perspectives, elevations, bird-eye views, and other points of view to comprehensively explore and capture the building. During this process, I identified about 26 aspects of architectural photography. A workshop was conducted at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville at the end of my trip, where we explored them in more detail. For example, composition, shooting on manual mode, and post-processing can be separate subjects on their own that require many classroom hours and practice in the field. So the first product of the project is a proficient documentation of about 20 examples of contemporary architecture in the United States. The book was edited with extensive coverage of 26 buildings. The second volume will include the remaining. Another format of presentation is that of monographs for specific buildings. In this example, we see the Red Rock Canyon Visitor Center outside of Las Vegas. This is one of the projects I discovered along the way. A second product is publications in print and web media. Additional time is required in preparation of these submissions. They are helpful, though, in entering into the mindset of editors and graphic designers. With the publication process, we are also becoming more aware of how the different aspect ratios in photography become important for presentations. Editing, the process of final selection, is yet another important aspect. a byproduct of licensing images for specific use. In this example, images from the National 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York were used for the Stowe Company Architecture Guide through the Archived Images Agency. Copyrights and licensing is another important aspect in architectural photography. During the editorial photo shoots, a recurring point of view gave the opportunity to create this series of architectonic abstractions. They were collected as standalone series, independent from the editorial presentation of the buildings. Nordigo is an exercise in sifting points of view as a gesture to reveal new and interesting information, compositions, and feelings. Spaces designed to form tangible connections between above and below by looking straight up towards the ceiling, the atrium, or the sky. The progression from indoor to outdoor spaces supplements the introvert-extrovert design polarity. While the pairing of classical buildings with modern, postmodern, and cosmogenic architecture allows for comparative viewing experiences and a diverse showcase of architectural typologies. We now move to selections from the fine art series produced during this trip. The sequence follows the scale gradient from building details to cityscapes. They combine representational and expressive types. Boomeritis presents standalone portraits of buildings with the long exposure technique. We depart from straight photography to fuse the boundaries between documentation and expression. Details of skyscrapers and public buildings, frontal views of iconic architecture, presented in a way that highlights the formalistic aspects of design. Desaturated or monochrome treatments emphasize the tectonic elements of the buildings. The title is a reference to the pathology of the baby boomer generation, characterized by pluralism infected with narcissism. To quote Wilber, "We must preserve the dignity of modernity, even while we attempt to overcome the disaster of modernity." Images will always be, by definition, two-dimensional. The experience of photographing them comprehensively, though, can enrich our awareness of the built environment. In serial vision, streetscapes are combined with architectural landmarks. Candid moments are a tribute to the classic street photography genre. Street photography is associated with the joy of simply walking around the city, observing the interaction between people and their surroundings, and creating a dynamic balance of the elements by way of framing and composition. A perspectival series takes a more intimate look at the man-altered landscape. In contrast to the carefully designed urban planning, contemporary cities are also characterized by their obsolete and unproductive spaces, undefined without specific limits. As such, they manifest as spaces of freedom and represent an anonymous reality outside the urban regeneration policies. With the Empire State of Mind series, the scale is broadened to open vistas, in search of the iconic and the genius loci. The coupling of city and countryside reflects the dichotomy of contemporary living. The 2-to-1 ratio follows the panoramic feeling of vastness. Experiencing the American landscape I am reminded of Rem Koolhaas' bigness. He wrote, "Beyond a certain scale, architecture acquires the properties of bigness. The best reason to broach bigness is the one given by climbers on Mount Everest, because it is there. Bigness is ultimate architecture," as he wrote. Worldviews is a series of long exposure urban waterscapes. Blurred water and moving skies meet building silhouettes and auxiliary structures in emergent dance between the perpetual and the ephemeral. As the shutter takes more time to let light into the sensor, so the photographer takes more time to get absorbed by the scene and invites the viewer to have a similar unifying visual experience. Having lived most of my life near water, a deep connection with this element has been formed. Scenes that combine cityscapes with waterscapes are dear to my heart. Arriving in places, the new and unfamiliar is counterbalanced by the familiarity of the waterfront. When we put aside all the analysis, we find what they refer in Zen as the beginner's mind. A fresh look, as if we just witnessed the wonders of this world. A peaceful feeling of completion and the sheer joy of being. When we momentarily drop all we know, we can rest in one taste, in the unifying consciousness that all is one. A second book was edited with selected images from the fine art series. The publishing industry has changed considerably with the coming of the World Wide Web. Self-publishing and online distribution offers alternatives to many artists. Even so, a hard copy of a book and a fine art print of an image still have an added value to the visual experience of photography. Another way of presentation is videography, using the technique of time-lapse and hyperlapse. We presented a clip at the end of Mark's presentation. Combining still with moving images adds the dimension of time to architecture and gives a more lively feel. The Fulbright Foundation in Greece also organizes the program Art Supports Education. Proceeds from the artwork support the funding of next scholarships. In this exhibition, the curation theme was polymorphia, the multidimensionality of artistic expression across various art forms. The ESO Architecture Conference is organized in Athens by Archisearch every year, bringing together various sectors of the industry. A video was presented combining still and moving images from the project. During the trip, I also contacted fine art and commercial architecture photographers. With some of them, we did a photo walk around the city and discussed our projects. With others, interviews were conducted and published at the Danish architecture website. The questions for the interviews were also based on the 4 quadrants. A presentation was given at the Trieste Photo Days Festival. A traveling exhibition is in the approval phase in collaboration with the Hellenic Institute of Architecture. Collectively, this body of work becomes a richer, multidimensional view on photography and architecture. What I hope the work illustrates is that architecture photography can be much more than the narrow definition of photographing a building for a single purpose or one client. Before, during, and after this project, I felt that these 4 roles of photography as self-expression, exploration, communication and education, and as vocation have an important and equal part to contribute. Put together, they comprise a broader cultural asset. Before moving to part 3, we will have another video interlude. The next iteration of the collaboration between Mark, Suzanne, and myself was to develop and conduct a traveling workshop with students from the University of Tennessee. The theme was capturing the human experience in place. During 3 weeks, we traveled around Athens, the countryside, and the islands. We included classroom presentations, on-situ workshops with the instructors, assignments for the students to explore on their own, guest talks and guided tours with local professionals in related fields. The video shows impressions from this course. Welcome back. In the third part of the lecture, we will explore some integral photography themes along with related examples. So far, we have focused on three elements of the integral model: quadrants, levels, and types. We will briefly look at the remaining two: lines and states. Humans have multiple intelligences, and each one develops independently from the others. We can be highly advanced cognitively, but low in emotional intelligence. The integral transformative practice is a system that touches upon different aspects of the human development and recommends a cross-training. It leaves it up to the individual to select which ones to choose. It is not possible to practice them all simultaneously. The point here is that if we include different lines, our overall performance benefits in a cross-training fashion. I have selected 8 developmental lines that we can relate to the practice of photography: vital or energetic, technical, critical or mental, psychological, public or social, ethical, contemplative or spiritual, and holistic. Every person can create their own questions, and by doing so, set their own intentions when they consider how each line relates to their work. One question for the vital line can be, how much can I enter into a raw photographic flow? For the coverage of the Expo Milano, I had to work fast from day to night for 10 straight days in order to fully cover all the pavilions. In the technical line, a question can be, how skillful can I be with the techniques and crafts of photography? The color image on the right uses a specific workflow in photography, in Photoshop, to amplify contrast. The black and white image on the left changes the workflow to a minimalist scale, waterscape. In the critical line, a question can be, how accessible can I be to the larger forces and systems of the photographic world? The Architectural Guide to Doha was created in collaboration with MIMOA and the Qatar Foundation. 1 month in research and planning, 1 month photographing in the city, and several months developing and presenting this work in various outlets. In the psychological line, a question can be, how well can I surpass my creative barriers? In the hotel photo shoot, my barriers had to do with working with large groups of people: stylists, models, artistic directors, hotel managers, and how to maintain my vision and flow. In the Lebanon photo shoot, my barriers had to do with having a preconceived idea of the results. In the public line, the question can be, do my presentations entertain, educate, and enlighten? In this boutique hotel, I used different formats and techniques to touch upon all three. For the present lecture, you can be the judge of that at the end. In the ethical line, a question can be, how much can I give back to my community? The collective exhibition in Rome was a fundraising for a children's hospital. The exhibition in Aclio was a cultural event to raise awareness about lagoons and their biodiversity. In the contemplative line, one question can be, does my work touch upon or reflect or express a unifying consciousness? In the holistic line, the question can be, how aware can I be of my entire photographic practice and process? It seems to me that our presentation here is a heightened example of that. Moving on to the second theme. In the first part, we discussed levels of development: traditional, modern, postmodern, and integral. They develop collectively over extended periods of time and become permanent building blocks of our worldviews. States of consciousness, on the other hand, are temporary and directly accessible to us. Our brain waves and mental faculties are different in each state. They are as important to the creative process as levels. We will go through a few examples as they relate to photography. The still point of our awareness is at the heart of the creative process. To be still is to create a state of consciousness that is open and receptive. Meditation and yoga cultivate this inner state of being. Cultivate the ability to experience things directly, without evaluation or labeling or judging. The World Expos are great examples of temporal structures and ephemeral experiences. Countries from around the world compress within their pavilion designs various aspects of their identity. One can better enjoy them with direct experience instead of intellectualizing. Be in the moment. Be mindful in the daily activities. During some moments, the water comes down and becomes a reflection of the surrounding, adding to the felt aesthetic of the image. Look with undivided attention. Let the object become your contemplation. Embody the act of love in sight. Here, a literal love in sight occurred with careful observation as I was exploring this pool terrace. From a particular point of view, the shape of the pool became a heart. Intimacy breaks polarities and merges opposites. Find beauty through intimacy. For this exhibition, architectural details from the Expo pavilions were paired together. Express things for what else they are. In the left image, the detail of Hadid's Riverside Museum becomes a heartbeat. In the right image, the facade of an office building becomes a glass symphony. In part one, we saw a few examples of types, from documentary to expressive. Another way to illustrate the typological spectrum is by looking at the results from international photography competitions. Selected results from many competitions have been catalogued. They include single images and series of images from a project, fine art and commercial work, professional and amateur entries, commission assignments and personal projects, and subcategories of cityscapes, buildings, bridges, industrial, historical, interior, and abstract. The typological spectrum treats all types of expression with equal artistic value. Most competitions are online nowadays, and the act of curating them can be an educational practice to broaden our typological visual vocabulary. So far, we have analyzed sustainable design and photography using the 4 quadrants. Let's look at the quadratic analysis of art along with some photographic examples. We could say that they begin in one of the 4 quadrants, but they also have a cross-quadrant transmission. With the expressivist approach, the emphasis is on the original intention of the creator. Artists from this approach use the medium as a vehicle for expressing an inner state. Integral theory names this the primal art holon. The architecture of Frank Gehry can be considered as expressive. The intention of this image from the Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle was to follow this approach. This abstract looks like an alien creature coming to life. At the documentary level, the photographer tries to capture the building as best as possible without judging or evaluating its architecture. With the expressivist approach, some images from the building can become part of an independent and more critical concept, while at the same time keeping the photographer's aesthetic. With the formalist approach, the emphasis is on the formal elements of the artwork and its structural integrity. This group of artists turns the focus away from the expression of feelings and concentrates on a more realistic attitude. Integral theory names this the artwork holon. The Orbit urban office campus in Athens is ample with formalist elements. The client's brief was to capture the building at night in order to focus on the architectural lighting. The cross-quadrant transmission, in this case, was achieved by capturing details of the interplay between light and form of the facades and create standalone architectural abstractions. With the reception and response approach, emphasis is given on the multiplicity of interpretations. The value is assigned by the community of viewers and historicity. The majority of postmodern artists use their medium to facilitate a response. Integral theory names this the viewer holon. In hospitality, the visitor's reception and response is all too important. The hotel asked for images to be used for their website and for booking purposes. In this case, the cross-quadrant transmission becomes amplified with an iconic image from the photo shoot. A commercial image becomes part of the fine art photography realm. It gets applied to the travel and drone category and to both color and black and white editions. My intention was also to produce an architectural photography portfolio along with the hospitality one. With licensing the images to the interior designer, the project is also disseminated in the architecture publication world. With a symptomatic approach, the emphasis is given on larger socio-political currents, which operate in the background. Art is symptomatic to those forces and dysfunctions. Artists focus on the depiction of social identities and inequalities. Integral theory names this the context holon. The selected project is charged with symptomatic elements. The subject matter is the underground metro stations in Athens and Thessaloniki. The client was Attiko Metro, the public organization managing their construction under the Ministry of Transportation. The brief was to portray the finished stations and document the metro lines under construction. In this case, the cross-quadrant transmission occurs with the help of typological fluidity in the photographer's original intent. The abstract images on the right were produced with in-camera motion blur during a moving locomotive in the tunnels. Architectural photography ends with a completed project, but it starts with and progresses for months or years with numerous specialized construction phases that remain unseen to the general public. The images in this case are also used as a symbol of investment and progress. For the multi-level communication, we are looking at an example outside architecture to illustrate that this approach can apply to photography in general. I would also like to note that these themes are rarely found in a single image or even in a series of images, but rather when we examine a photographer's body of work holistically. Gregory Colbert's works are collaborations between humans and other species. They express the poetic sensibilities and imaginations of humans and animals. His images offer an inclusive vision of the natural world. They depict a symmetry between humanity and the rest of life. Colbert spent a number of the years around the world with his subject. He combined breathtaking still images with feature-length meditative videography. The Nomadic Museum was designed with recycled materials, assembled and disassembled to be taken to the next location. Proceeds from his TED Talk award went to the Foundation for Animal Use Royalties. Ashes and Snow has attracted over 10 million visitors, making it the most attended exhibition by a living artist in history. His work is an inspirational example of integral photography. Colbert's first exhibition took place in Venice, so I thought it is a fitting note for this occasion. I would like to end with a quote from David Harvey's The Condition of Postmodernity. It seems to me that living in a city is an art, and we need the vocabulary of art to describe the peculiar relation between man and material that exists in the continual creative play of urban living. The city, as we imagine it, the soft city of illusion, myth, aspiration, nightmare, is as real, maybe more real, than the hard city one can locate in maps and statistics, in monographs of urban sociology and architecture. Lastly, for the theme of the built environment as a dynamic phenomenon, we are presenting the video Expo Milano Glimpses. Thank you for your time and attention.
Everything is interesting, and I would like to open the question time in this moment. I am the pleasure also to introduce you my colleague Angelo Maggi, who is the responsible of internationality in Iuav, international relationships, perhaps. But Angelo is also a teacher, an historical professor, a professor of history, and he is an expert of photography. I think that he is teaching also about photography history. So I would like to invite Angelo to make some questions.
Well, thank you for inviting. Such a pleasure to have people who work on the concept of architecture and photography, and photographers who are working on this. I attended all of it. I really like certain approaches which are very similar to the ones I work with. And I have a couple of questions. One is to Mark about the concept of a typology of an architecture photography. I'm very intrigued by this idea. I have something in my mind. I don't know if I can find someone who thinks it like me. When I do my teaching stuff, my teaching work in here in Iuav, I always present, like in the 1950s, a very strong input given by a man called Éric Desmarais. And he did a wonderful book in the 1960s afterwards within making different typologies of architecture photography. And he invented some terms which I was very keen on, like, let's say, wallscape, roofscape, working on the idea of pavimentation in architecture. There are a lot of things which are happening in the 1950s, which is something you didn't catch when you were speaking, because you presented Charles Sheeler, you presented, like, for example, the quadrant with all the elements, which I was very intrigued about, that, like, working on semiotics and photography at the same time. But what had happened in that specific era, we have several architects which are working on photography as well and urban development, and they were like for example, Lawrence Halprin, who did a book on cities, and if you go in that book, you will see a subdivision of architecture photography. He was an architect, but at the same time a photographer, but giving this typology. So why is it important for you, this use of typology in architecture photography? So obviously all the project is influenced by your input, and the fact that the photographer has been to the University of Tennessee and you did the project, the workshop in Greece back. But I think what I'm intrigued is, like, I've always thought there is a big important need to do an analysis of making a typology for architecture photography vision. And so finally I found someone who thinks it in a certain sense like me. So I think it's an important thing that maybe we could discuss about this later on in the future. But I think in the 1950s it's something that needs to be analyzed, because between what you were saying, like the contemporary era and the new topographers, there's something going on. And you have plenty of books. For example, there's another one which was published in 1936. It's called The Appreciation of Architecture. I translated it in Italian. And you will find in that book categories of vision for architecture photography as well. And this a man called Robert Byron is looking about the dynamics, the mobility in a building, the mobility in the city. So there are all different elements, 16 typologies, which are fundamental to understand architecture. So there is an evolution, I think, in the 1950s, which has been forgotten. So if you have a chance to see again, to look at Halprin, like cities, and maybe Éric Desmarais, how he subdivides them, I was also trying to find, but I can't find it. It's in my library somewhere. Another guy who did something very similar to your job recently, and he published it as parallel lines. So looking at facades and looking at the, architecture photography and putting them under a certain kind of score. So I think there's a lot of potential here. So I really enjoyed it. And my question is, because it's very difficult to teach architecture photography at Iuav. Margherita says, I'm an historian, and to fit yourself in a sort of interdisciplinary role like architecture photography as a project, not only as a document, as an aesthetic value. I think all these things are quite important, and they are also easy to gain for a student because photography is very close to everybody. So I think this is an important step. So there are questions. I hope you can understand that. I have a few questions, but there is a lot of emotional thing here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Angelo.
My way of thinking.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great. I have heard of some of these sources that you mentioned, but now you have some things for us to go and investigate. We were just looking at a very simple typology of how people practice. So it's really more from the body of work or the point of view of the photographer, and whether they're trying to document something to say what it is, or whether they're trying to portray the building in an editorial fashion, or, on the other hand, whether they're trying to just have an artistic vision. Typology is a complicated thing, I think, and within the integral model, it's probably one of the aspects that is developed the least, I think, in terms of the theory. So from the model, from the perspective of the model, we can have types in each quadrant. And so, for instance, we can have, as you know, architectural building typologies. So that's a way of looking at patterns of built form. Of course, the roofscape, wallscape, things like that, those become typologies of particular kinds of content. So there's many, I think from any quadrant, we can have typologies. So that makes it more complex, perhaps, right? Because traditionally, architects think about typology only in terms of the building, the built form, or an urban pattern typology, things like that. So, yeah, I think it's a broad, wide open field, and you asked some very good questions there.
Like, for example, this idea of there is an evolution in the concept of a detail which is pictured, but it's also like when you categorize it, you are forcing people to follow your thoughts about it. Okay, so you get in an idea of looking at the floorscape as a urban detail or something like that. But when you get to, I have it here. I'm always very keen on looking at Lawrence Holpring, like a man who's looking at fences and walls and putting them together. It looks like this idea, which was developed a bit early in the 19th century, when you have all these typologies in the world of art and putting them together and analyzing them. So the thing is that I think it's more evoluted. In architecture, it's easier to work it out instead of finding it in the world of art. So and the fact that they were publishing these books, which are illustrated as well. So there's an editorial pattern, but there is also a sort of theory behind looking at architecture. So my feeling is that I think this is the further step you are practicing right now. So that's why I'm quite intrigued by this and the fact that you're approaching here in Iuav. So what's going on next? That's what I'm wondering. So is there going to be a project about this with our school or not?
I look at Mark stopped. fix.
Oh,
Mark, are you with us? No.
well, we might ask Pygmalion to answer if he wants to.
Yeah.
So you are experiencing this idea of, you know, looking at the space, but also categorizing. So how do you feel in putting these, you know, your own work as a photographer in this kind of typology cut?
Hi, Angelo.
Hi.
Thank you for your feedback. Some of the references you mentioned from the 50s and those books, I'm not aware of them so much, so I would very much appreciate if you email them to me and we can discuss it more. But this basic spectrum that we thought of having with the three types, you know, from one extreme that is very topographic, just looking at the environment and documenting, all the way to the very other end that you have a lot of expressive, even you lose sight of what you're looking at some time. I think this was the most generic, the most simple, that you can actually fit in there a lot of types. So it was, I think it is a good starting point for photographers or maybe for architects also. When we look at typologies in architecture, you know, if you think of Charles Jenks,
yeah,
and his work is so complicated, so many architectural languages that you might get lost in all the types. So the idea behind this was to create a very starting point, which is very simple for people to start, and then if they want to make it even more complicated, they can do so.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no. I think that your project it's intriguing. So what I was wondering is, like, is this an evolution of that kind of separating things and making probably more readable architecture? I think that's what your aim is. Like when you are introducing your students in this workshop you did in Greece, I think you did something like that. So guiding them to look at architecture under a certain point of view. And after that, when you put it back, it's like a database, I think, in my mind. I don't know. Maybe it's not what you want, but in a certain sense, this is some simplifying, because as well, when you are teaching architecture photography, that's what I understood. And it's also easier to let students understand the importance of a composition instead of the importance of documenting architecture. So I could see in this quadrant you had different sources, but at the same time different way of, you know, helping, aiding your students to go toward a certain kind of image. But obviously, I think this is maybe a subject that I have to refine as well in my head a bit better, because I didn't expect this today. So I was really curious about, you know, this idea of the integral concepts. And I also very much when Mark was telling us about the new pictorial, which is another subject I do believe in. And it's something that I've been talking about several years ago. And I've been accused by photographers who said, why are you using this term like new pictorial in photography with an architect? I said, well, if you are doing post-production, if you are manipulating an image that is pictorial from an historical point of view, so you cannot avoid it. And so now you use new pictorialism as a term which has been acquired, which I said, wow. So finally it turned up. So in a sense, I have to say it's quite difficult. Hi Mark, sorry, we were like chatting here.
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened on my end, but I couldn't reconnect until now.
Okay, so no, I was just telling that this concept of considering typology in a new way, and also I was quoting your introduction about new pictorial in photography, which I do agree with you. There is a phase which could be considered new pictorialism in the contemporary world. when, I don't know, we think about maybe photographers who do a bit of stage photography. Fernando Guerra, you were showing us the one about Alvaro Siza. You know, you were telling about the man who was there, but are we real sure that that is like genuinely constructed, or is it a real stage photography? Because Fernando Guerra is quite popular on Instagram about his work. I love his work. You know, I love humanity in architecture photography.
Yeah,
I do love it. So in a certain sense, I as I said, I hope this is the first step for a collaboration. I don't know what's going to happen next with Iuav, but I think you should come here and organize a workshop with us. So I'll be delighted to be like part of the group and giving all my students this efforts to look.
Yeah, that sounds fabulous. But you know, we need the man. I'm just as I said, I'm the hobbyist, and Pygmalion is the professional. I keep trying to learn something from him. Pygmalion, you may want to jump in here, because this idea of types, I think, is an interesting theme, and it's one of the things we were trying to emphasize today. The idea that, you know, types goes through all the levels, right? So we have, for instance, you know, in some of the topographists, right, Pygmalion, we have these series of studies about the same building type, right, or industrial type, photographed from the same viewpoint, as if they're sitting side by side. Right?
The Becker. You're referring to the Becker.
Yes, yes, yeah. Yes.
Well, that's another project. You see, that's another way of looking at the urbanscape and putting together. So but I think what is quite important is the terminology. So from a literary point of view, I'm quite intrigued by that. Like you have, let me just double check here. When you get to this idea of monumentality in the architecture photography, or texture, I don't know, so trees as foils. So you get this pictorial record. These are all elements which are typical of the literature. As well, I'm also thinking of another very curious book which was done about Italy in the 1960s. It was called The Italian Townscape, and the people who did it they were working on the architecture record. So they were involved in a magazine, and they were like looking at historical historical centers and subdividing them with typology, and again using photography to do that, which in a certain sense makes me think that whoever works in design and urban design is intrigued of using a certain kind of typology and putting pictures in a certain way, so for subdividing them. So I think this is a point that needs to be, like, again, considered. And maybe it's going to be quite unusual what will be the turnover, what will turn up out of this kind of research. Because as I can see, your work is already very, very deep and fully qualified. So that's what surprises me very much. You know, getting again in this kind of subjects, which I hope, you know, maybe something to think about in a workshop. Maybe we should tease a bit Margherita about this when she's organizing the workshop Wave, you know, forcing students to go around Venice and subdivide them in a certain kind of typology through the image. And that's helping a student and also us to understand better what is the urban environment we live in.
Yes.
Thank you.
Pygmalion, maybe you had a chance to speak when we were offline, but jump in here, because
yes,
we're practicing the types, actually.
Yes, I did discuss with Angelo a little bit about types, and I agree with him that, like we did in the workshop in Greece, we gave this exercise to students when we visited, for example, the Acropolis, to try to produce images from these three different types as an exercise, which puts you in a different exploration and mindset and so on. So this exercise you spoke about in Venice, groups of people going out with a specific assignment and bringing them together to see how they explore the part of the city. I think it's very interesting ideas. When COVID allows us to travel, we have this issue at the moment. So that would be wonderful to be able to organize a workshop there.
Very nice. Yeah.
Yeah, if the travel allows, next May, we're planning another trip, Suzanne, myself, and Pygmalion, again with students from Tennessee, to go back to Greece and some different locations. So we're hoping to continue this idea of remote learning, but by going to remote places, or places that are remote to us at least, you know, going on site. It's a whole different experiential way of learning things. We love it.
Perfect. We have another workshop to do.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask if someone of the participants has a question. Thank you, Angelo.
No, I hope I didn't get
Thank you.
much time. I don't want to take time from the students or whoever is in this. I was just giving my point of view, but I was really pleased. Thanks, Margherita, for inviting me here. And I told some of my students as well to attend. So I hope they're here and they ask questions.
We have the recorded lecture on YouTube. So if someone want to view again the lecture, is possible to read again. From the researchers, from the research fellows, raise your hand. Daniela?
Yes. Good
Hi.
afternoon. Thank you, Pygmalion, for this presentation. I have a question. Maybe it's a naive question, but I'll try to make it. When I look at your photos, especially those of part 1 and part 2, they have a sort of constant, powerful, but at the same time dramatic atmosphere. So I ask myself, is it due to a technical aspect, because it's the long exposure time, or is due to the dramatic situation of compressed together all the perspective, or it's more your personal mark? I don't know if I was clear.
Yes. I have one question. Which series of photographs you are talking about?
Part 1 and part 2. Part 1 and part 2. So
okay.
These with a long exposure time, they have a sort of dramatic sky, dramatic atmosphere, and also powerful. So this is why.
Okay. Yeah, it is partly because of the technique, the long exposure technique that you can, but also the way you post-process them, because you can still use long exposure and you can make very, very soft landscapes. So it is a combination of the two. It was my own intention to make it more dramatic, but also sometimes it's the situation itself. You know, sometimes the weather is quite dramatic itself. So I would say it depends. It's a combination of the three.
Yes. Okay. So the combination of the three. So of course there is also your, let's say, artistic mark.
Yes, the way I like them finished.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you know, you see this when I first began to look at architectural photography. I think I inherited a certain perspective about authenticity of a photograph, about trying to reproduce something and making sure that you know, that the photographer wasn't changing the very nature of what the image was or what the building is. But then when you go over to the expressive type, and especially when you leave the modern view, you're freed up in a way. And so then I think it becomes about what you're aware of. Are you doing something consciously, and can you also, let's say, be authentic about telling the story about that image? And so that's, I think, what Pygmalion's really good at. He unpacks and reveals for us, this is the image, this is what came from the camera in its raw mode, and then this is what I did with it. And that's lovely to see, I think, because even when we take a picture with a camera phone now, there's so many algorithms and processings that's automatically built in to make the picture look much better than the raw data that's arriving at that sensor. That the photo we see from our phone is really nothing like what you would get if you took that photograph on film and then processed that film and printed it directly. So anyway, what I like about where this is going, you asked, Angelo, is some of the things that Pygmalion is adding in the end in part 3, which is the point of view of what is it like to be the photographer in the moment of practicing, and what kind of awareness can you hold while you're in the midst of the flow of the complexity of doing a job, right? To be reflecting in action. So Pygmalion, I wonder if you might just say a little bit about that, about your new, I would say not your new work, but your new expression of sharing that perspective with other people, where you're headed.
The last part with states and lines and so on.
States and lines, and those become characteristics of, let's say, the integral consciousness as an artistic or creative individual.
Well, the flow, the photographic flow, is definitely a very interesting subject, and very difficult to put down in a few words, because so much is happening, in your body, in your mind, and your emotions. It's quite. Sorry.
No, you're good. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to, with these states and lines, I tried to start giving small ideas of how rich this is, the experience of when you photograph, and you cannot show it in one image, or you cannot talk about it with just one subject. It's a very rich experience. That was the idea of that part.
Just to illustrate that, I have a funny story. The first time I went for a lesson with Pygmalion, he's teaching me how to do this long exposure technique, and so he lets me borrow the filter for my lens, the same that fit his lens, and he's just describing here all the things you have to become aware of, and while you're trying to work on the site. And I was not very aware, and I dropped his lens, his filter into the river in the process. So, yeah, there's a lot to take in that process.
You're still alive, aren't you?
Yeah. I tried to make up for it later.
Yeah. It is an intense process physically. What I mentioned, for example, from the Expo Milano, there were more than 100 buildings, the pavilions and the additional structures. So in a 10-day period, it becomes physically very intense to remain focused and all the logistics aside, just to photograph every building, interior, exterior, with different techniques. It was a very intense experience, different from visiting the expo for pleasure.
It was intense too. But
I wonder if we have some other researchers, some other fellows.
Some other fellows, some other students.
Some students.
We
Yes.
have also the next students of didactic seminar. So I try to include another consideration about nature in your pictures. I would like to understand better. We have many forms of water. The water and the sky as nature, as a material, no? It is a kind of presence inside the picture, as a subject, as something that creates the connection between artifacts and nature. When we move inside the videos, I think that in your way of representation, this complexity, movement is the nature. It's something like the nature component inside the image. This is my impression about this video. And I look at these forms of water, this form of movements inside the picture as something that creates the complexities. I don't know if is it clear. The complexity of the image of the vision is connected with the role of media, the role of the media that are water, sky, and movement.
Okay. Yeah, I think I understand. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
This is an aspect that seems very important for understanding the complexity of contemporary city, and also for understanding the complexity of landscape. I am very involved in the landscape of water, no? And this kind of media that are the transition spaces between land and water. In this, in your photos and also in your digital exhibition, I think that this aspect is very important for understanding how much the complexity is in the transition spaces. So I would like to understand better in your poetic, in your approach, if this is an aspect that you consider, or is only something that is inside your art.
Well, this I mentioned at some point in the presentation that some of these spaces are obsolete, or they don't work well, they are not taken care after very well. And so it is interesting to find spaces that are not urban design, beautiful parks, and to create something beautiful out of a bad situation, of a bad space.
Mm-hmm.
But also the different elements, as you mentioned, when their complexity becomes oversimplified when you work with this process. So you have many elements that sometimes in the photograph are very distractive. They are distractive to the eye. So with this process, you eliminate most of the distractions to make it more calm and more easy to view.
Yeah, in the long exposures, the motion of the water becomes smoothed, while at the same time, the drama of the sky also gets amplified in some ways, smoothed out, but it becomes something more apparent because the buildings, things that don't move, they look exactly the same as a quick exposure. But the things that do move, that becomes part of your attention. Even if it's smoothed out to be calm, it becomes a contrast, right? And then in the time lapses, somehow the smoothness and slowness of nature changes that we ordinarily see. The cloud, if we look up, is moving slowly, but in the time lapse, it's moving rapidly. Right? And so that dynamic aspect of change and of nature and time, it gets amplified. So maybe, Margarita, that's one thing you're noticing, is there is something different about the aspect of nature as something that's changing. But we also see that in the human aspects. We see people moving. In the nighttime scenes that he does, we see vehicles moving or streaks of light and things like that. So both of them can be emphasized.
Okay, some years ago, not so much, but perhaps 20 years ago, we made architectural photos only without persons. So we have also to consider this aspect.
That's the problem. That's
the problem.
Well, because this is something that we are used to understand. This is what they taught us when we were like students at Iuav, like looking at these wonderful magazines, Casabella, Domus, and the idea of Gabriele Basilico, which in Italy was like the guru of architecture photography, where you have these empty spaces, and the more it's empty, the better it looks. But things are changing. So the humanity in the pictures coming back. And we also kept forgetting people who did a lot of work on the humanity of photography, like George Everett Smith or other people like that, because Ezra Stoller was the commercial, the one that Mark was telling about, the picture of the falling water. That is an iconic image of Frank Lloyd Wright. But Frank Lloyd Wright didn't like it. So we had a lot of people who were like living, the living image, as it's called. It's part of our nature, and things like this are coming back. But it's very curious that now we are looking at the nature from an aerial point of view. Burtyninski is like giving us what is the human being, what is the nature now, but there's no human presence there. You can't see it because it's very small. So this is coming back. It's a sort of story that goes on and on and on and on. So I think Fernando Guerra, Yuan Ban as well is using a lot of human figures now, because all these empty spaces do not exist anymore. I don't know what will happen after COVID, because there is an idea now of having all these books. I don't know if you noticed. We had a magazine in Italy which was like a sort of something to buy. Everybody went and bought it, with the empty cities, pictures of the empty cities again. And now they're making different books. I think they issued recently one about the European empty cities thanks to COVID. So I don't know, I'm a bit worried. We finally got the humanity in the photography, and now it's disappearing again, but from a real point of view. So, well, I don't know, it's a fascinating subject, this one of the scale, because human being in photography do give you the scale. and they will make it more familiar. So that's why they work out very, very well, because, you know, building is the universal language. Building, you know, what was it said? I don't remember now the quote, but there is an exact quote which says that the human being in a photography gives you the correct skill, but also the humanity of it.
So Pygmalion, you have sometimes this issue working with your clients. If you do a job for an architect, maybe they want no people sometimes, and then sometimes they do, but then you have, do you take models, staged photographs, or do you take natural photographs, which means now the building has to be occupied for some time so that there are natural people there using the place?
All the above.
Yeah.
Some architects actually they do prefer the buildings empty. When I am in the street views, I take photographs empty as much as possible, but I also try to include images with people. If they don't like them, I keep them for myself. Some images I prefer like this. For interiors also, it depends. You know, some people, they like to have it more lively. Definitely in hotel situations, you want to show that the guests and all this setup. Some of that can be accidental or can be less the feeling of that you staged it. It is staged, and sometimes it is more casual.
Well, you have to remember that you do have, with post-production, a lot of architects and photographers which are taking off the cables, they are taking off the cars from the picture. If the composition is good and maybe there's just a rumor, we call it in Italian rumore in the photography, so something that is like not acting properly, and you can actually cut it off. It's not going to hurt the picture. They did that even with analogical photography, photographers which were developing inside the camera obscura. They
Yes,
used to, you know, make things come up and turn away or disappear. So I think it's like we're always very enchanted by the beauty of an architecture photography if it respects some kind of canons, okay? Like the Charles Schiller ones. He was a painter, so the composition is obviously perfect there, because, you know, who better than a painter could understand how light works on a building and reproduce it in the painting and also in the photography. So it's always a matter of remembering that photography is drawing with light. So as much as you know that, it works.
I would like to listen something else, but someone else, sorry. But I also have another question. Is the integral lens a progressive lens? For I am with the glass. Progressive lens that is created the connection between the different scales, different dimensions, and is human nature in the same plan of connection for integral lens, for Marx, for Pygmalion, because this aspect of composition of the four quadrant is a kind of logic approach, no? Is the necessity to understand the process, to represent the process, but also to create a condition for understanding the complexity of arts. And I think this is also something not easy, and something that can create also a particular network for the arts, but also a margin, a border for the arts itself. May we explain the art?
You want to take that one, Pygmalion?
Well, there were a few questions. One of them, in reference to nature, that I couldn't think of, relates to a little bit on the work that we did with Mark during the workshop. I think he will present more of it in the next lecture. So there are many elements of nature that relate to the building, about its sustainability, for example. And Mark, I think, is investigating so many schemas, right, Mark?
Yes.
We think that so we can use photography to capture many of them. So maybe that was my answer to that question: nature, photography, and the experience of when we have with the buildings.
So, Margarita, to your question about the progressive lens,
with the year going on, we need the.
So, you know, in terms of actual scale, we're dealing with, you know, I refer that as a kind of phenomenon that appears only when we take the system's perspective, and only at a certain worldview. That is, in a pre-modern worldview, the ranges of scale that can be accommodated in the human mind at one time are quite limited, usually from the point of view of the person. So I like to illustrate that with, you know, when I first went to India, I landed in the city of Ahmedabad, and I knew where I wanted to go. I had the address, and so I got in the taxi, and the driver of the taxi just looked at me like, "Tell me what to do next." And I said, "Well, I need to go to this address," and he just threw up his hands. And after lots of back and forth between English and Gujarati and Hindi, finally he says, university. And university meant go to the other side of the river. And then from there, he looks around and says, "Well, what next?" And so we would stop and ask questions and get directions. And then he would say, the Parimal Garden. And then we would go to the Parimal Garden. And then he looks around like, "Well, what's next?" And like, I'm supposed to know this. So the actual place was a certain building, which was opposite of a hospital near the Parimal Garden, which you had to access from the university district, which was in another part of town. And so the point being that the universe of the person driving the taxi was not existing in a Cartesian grid, right? Is the notion of space was always tied to the location of the person. And everything was in relation to where I am now, with, you know, me as the center of a radial universe, right? So scale in that sense didn't make much sense, right? It wasn't the same kind of scale of the modern mind, right? And now we're able to see scale. We don't have to locate ourselves always in a Cartesian grid. So that's all lower right perspective looked at from different levels, different worldviews, right? And that's so integral is just a kind of a map, which is maybe not a perfect map, but a map that begins to help us to make sense out of why one person can't understand another person, or why one person takes a very strong point of view about architecture and wants to vehemently disagree with another person's point of view, and they all have something to say. So in photography, what one is presented with is concrete imagery of places, of the built environment, and how do we make sense out of all of that diversity, all of that complexity. So we try out this map. Some of it is the lens itself is, I won't say arbitrary, but it is constructed. So we construct a map. And that map, for instance, in levels, different researchers about the human development have different numbers of levels. Some have 3, some have 5, some have 12, and so forth. You can subdivide it like we're using an architect's scale. If you change the scale, the number of divisions is different, right? But it's still the same A to B distance. So other aspects of the integral model seem to be fundamental to the way humans see the world. So the quadrants, if we think about those as essential or fundamental perspectives, those ways of looking at the world show up in every culture and every language. That, you know, that idea of the first person, the second person, the third person, I, we, and so on. That seems to be fundamental, and then it shows up in our universities. So we have the arts and the humanities and the sciences taking radically different perspectives, even if they look at the same thing. So there's both the fundamental, which seems to be universal, seems to be something that we can say is accurate and true to the extent that we don't have very many exceptions to the rules. And then other aspects would seem constructed and yet sit on a basis of empirical knowledge. And then we have other ones that seem, other aspects to the model where the grooves are less laid down, where things are in development, and you know, I think of it like the old slide projector, you know, where you could focus the image and we get sharper or or fuzzier. And so some of the aspects of any framing approach can be like that, a little fuzzy in the beginning, and gradually we hope they get more sharp. But it's also subject to testing. Maybe there's a better way to think about architectural typology than the simplistic 3 modes that we're using as a crude map. Maybe one can make a better map of that. But one of the things about this is that we don't want to get too hung up in intellectualizing without also embodying. And so I think, Pygmalion, I'm going to ask you a question because I think this is leading in where I want to take it, which is that when you're taking the perspectives, I'm going to propose that, well, Suzanne likes to say this, that when you take the perspective, it actually changes the person taking the perspective. That by operating in different points of view, the photographer becomes a changed person, a changed photographer, right? Do you see development happening because of this cross-training that you're talking about?
In my personal work?
Yeah, your personal work or your personal self?
Or myself.
Yourself, yes.
Yes, I think looking back at my work, it has developed quite a bit since the beginning. But also the more, as you were saying before, this is a simple but complicated but simplified model. And if it is progressive, if it can change, it depends on us, if we can change. And everyone can make their own interpretation of this model and try to apply it in their own work. So that would be one answer to that.
Very
Yes.
good.
Yes, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask again, any other question? I'm waiting for you, for your rising, but I think that it's a little
shy. They're shy. They're very shy.
Yes, it's strange, but
Even in the work, can they add a question in the chat?
other question in the chat?
No. Can a participant here type a question in the chat if they're too shy?
Well, they don't have to be shy because, you know, this is a sort of very friendly way of discussing.
Yeah, of course.
Stimulating as well. So.
So we have to close. Do you want to go away? But I have to say, and I am pleased for this occasion to talk with Mark, with Pygmalion and Angelo, and this is a good occasion also for making alive this approach to integral environment. And this is very important for us, for the research infrastructure, for our lab in IRIDE. But it is something that is part of our work from the beginning. We are always involved with the possibility of photography to connect with the perspective of the project. And this is very important for us. And the view from the artist, from the photographer, from the connection with the projection, so the perspective of the architect is something useful to go on. I think that as in many disciplines, this necessity to change our point of view and to connect our points of view is important. In this sense, I say you again, thank you so much. Thank you, Mark, for connecting us with your collaborative teams, and we are waiting for the last lecture in 2 weeks that is about nature, biophilic vision, and I think that Mark may also add something about this new event that is the 5th lecture of this lecture series. Thank you so much to all the participants, to Angelo, to Pygmalion, and to Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Angelo.
Thank you. Yes, nice to meet you all. Okay, so hope we manage to catch again each other. We'll let Margherita make something, okay? So il trait d'union qua. Ciao.
Bye.
Grazie a tutti.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.